course, we've got lots more insight that we're going to deep dive into. And of course, two speakers that I'd like to introduce to you briefly as we'll continue to get more details from them. Not only Mokladze Muklanyane, who is the head of alternative investments, but we'll also be joined by Mike Adsetts, who's the Deputy Chief Investment Officer of Momentum Investments. Well, we've heard from Mike very briefly, but just to give you some assurance in terms of some of his brief background, as mentioned, Mike is the Deputy Chief Investment Officer of Momentum Investments. Mike has a broad range of experience spanning investment consulting, investment, portfolio management, product development and client servicing that he's gained at Momentum Investments, as well as Old Mutual and Alexander Forbes. Mike, I guess as we look to build up on some of the background that we've certainly heard Sonia establish, not only from a global point of view, but really understanding the nuances within the South African environment, let's talk Momentum Investments approach here. And perhaps if you can give us some more insight as to how Momentum Investments is making these concepts, these themes, and even these investment returns real for the client base that you serve.
Thanks, Gugu. So let me just start and say that at Momentum Investments, we follow an integrated approach. And I don't know if the audience probably recalls a couple of years ago, it was very a bolt-on approach. There was the Alexander Forbes Targeted Development Investment Survey. That survey over time has become smaller, not because responsible investing has diminished, but because it's become far more all-consuming around how you should approach investments. So at Momentum Investments, we believe in an integrated approach. What that means is we disaggregate the environmental, the social and governance, and we think about every single type of investment we make. So just touching briefly on the environmental side, we'll look at how do we apply an environmental perspective in fixed interest, for instance. With the context of the South African economy, which is dominated by carbon to generate energy, we need to be very mindful that it's not a simple question of just how can we reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible. We need to understand the context and the construct of the economy, but also last year we signed on to the principle of a just transition, which in essence says, do not leave people behind. You know, for a project to get popular support and to be integrated into the economy, you need to be mindful what are the implications if you decommission a fire station or close down a coal mine. What are the alternative career paths in the new renewable energy place that you can put them into? So that's the environmental side. The governance side, we've got a very strong pedigree and history in terms of actively voting our proxies and engaging extensively. We talked about Exxaro, which is a coal producer. We invest in Exxaro, but as a coal producer, it's got a significant environmental component. So the issue is about how do you engage with the company and say, what are your policies around climate change? How are you mitigating the impact in the environment? How do you think about it? And how do you disclose it so it's open and transparent? So that's the governance side. And the social side, we've got some projects that Mokladze will talk to a little bit later that not only have a huge societal benefit, but meet the fundamental requirement from an investment perspective that we get decent returns. Now, that's the umbrella perspective. Today, we're going to hone in a little bit on the alternative investments and specifically the unlisted investments. And why we want to talk about them is those are the types of investments that you get very close to. They tend to be, in terms of quantum, smaller types of investments, but you get very close to the management teams of those investments, and you can have a fundamental and proper impact in terms of how those projects are run, and you influence and you have a very strong framework of what you want to achieve, what's the purpose, what's the intent of the types of investments. So very broadly, that's how we think about it across the different mandates and asset classes that we want to invest in.
I must say, Mike, that's actually quite refreshing because you've given us the overview of how you approach it from the listed environment point of view, and we understand the complexities that remain there. Many members of the media will be familiar with the companies that you made mention of and those complexities, but help us understand more about this bespoke approach, I guess, in the alternative space and in the unlisted environment. How do you approach this partnership to the companies that you seek to invest in?
So there's lots of different frameworks that you can adopt, and we use various frameworks and risk management controls. One of the ones that we've really started to embrace a lot more than in the past is around the Sustainable Development Goals. You're probably aware of the history. It was the 2030 target of the Millennium Development Goals. governments realized, the United Nations realized that it wasn't actually achievable, and they morphed into the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals or very focused goals that talk to or are a call to action to governments and companies to fundamentally transform their operations, the way they think, to achieve good in the world. Now, that's a lot of ground to cover. And what we've decided from a momentum investment perspective is we're going to hone in and focus on a couple of ones that are really close to our heart. So within the group, in downstairs, we've got the vaccine center that's run by Momentum Metropolitan.
Yes.
So good health and well-being is really one that we want to go into. In the alternative space, a strong focus area for us is clean energy and climate action. So those are a couple of the ones that we want to do. So when we think about the types of investments we make, we would just want to focus in this discussion a little bit more on the unlisted side. And why we like the unlisted side is we can have so much focus, intent, and target purpose in what we're trying to achieve, and we can hone them around specific sustainable development goals. It's not exclusionary. So very much you're going to achieve other sustainable development goals, but we think it's a clarion call to action that really refines you and gives you a clarity of purpose of saying, we want to purposefully invest like this and achieve this goal, and we're going to develop metrics and evidence around that.
Makes
So
sense.
that's more or less what we want to try and achieve.
Sounds like quite a sustainable platform and, of course, a way of approach in terms of the current climate that we're in. In the midst of a pandemic, we're well aware of the economic infrastructure that we also have a deficit of in a country like South Africa. So the focus on clean and affordable energy, good health and quality education, I know is one we'll touch on in just a moment with Moklatsi. But I guess to come back to you, Sonia, the SDGs, quite clear that it's a framework that we're working on. But why is it that Momentum Investments does believe that this is a solid framework to go with and will implement and reap the necessary returns and results that we're looking for here?
Yeah, Kuku, I'm very excited about it. I honestly think that it moves us away from, as you rightfully said, in the listed space, applying certain criteria and tools and screening methodologies to whittle it down to something that's more sustainable and more responsible in its approach, to now actually being in a position that you've got a roadmap that tells you what you want to achieve, first of all, a long-term view, and also that you can be much more targeted and explicit about it. I think it also helps the investor to understand what to hold you accountable to, right? It's always easy to, after you've made an investment, find some evidence for how you've been responsible and a job that was created. But if you set out a path like this, and you say, this is the targeted investments I'm going to make, it's a much more deliberate and focused approach. And I think it also helps with measurement, right? So if this is what Momentum Investments is saying, this is what we're about, this is what we're going to do, then the investor can hold us accountable at the end of the day. So I think it just brings in for better decision making, better quality conversations with our clients, but also being much more deliberate and focused about doing it in a meaningful way.
Makes sense. Mike, before I ask you what Momentum Investments has been up to in terms of forming portfolios and funds that actually might be aligned to this particular focus, I'm keen to ask if from a regulatory point of view, Regulation 28, has this assisted some of your efforts in terms of expanding this particular mandate in line with the SDG focus that we have in place here?
So very much so. So the revised Regulation 28 is trying to put infrastructure at the front and center of investments that the private sector should make. So clearly there is a big focus. I mean, there's a lot of nuances as well. So infrastructure investments by their nature are quite illiquid. So you've got to be very mindful of them. So it's not a case of just ramping up the investments in infrastructure. You've got to do it quite mindfully and carefully. But definitely from the president's perspective, he's advocated infrastructure investments as one of the key measures to try and reignite the economy after the COVID pandemic. There's some great infrastructure investments. There's some less great infrastructure investments. So you've got to be very mindful in terms of how you're approaching it. But with the Presidential Committee on Infrastructure Investments, revised Regulation 28 that's trying to advocate it, it's definitely an area that's receiving a lot of focus. It's an area that we've historically invested quite a lot in, but it's really allowed us to rethink what we're trying to achieve in the space. So it's going to be far more central, and we're going to spend a lot more time talking about the types of investments that we make in the space align to the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. So when we make this investment, why do we make it? What does it speak to from our focus areas?
So tell us, give us some of the scoop here as to what the particular portfolios are that Momentum Investment's been working on.
So I talked about a history of infrastructure investment. So what we've done is we've actually looked at our balance sheets and our investments and said, what do we have and where do we want to go from an investment perspective? So we launching and expanding a lot of our investments, and we've targeted them along 3 dimensions that really talks to the Sustainable Development Goals. So in South Africa, we know we're a carbon-based economy. We are all highly aware of the energy crisis in the country, so we need to address energy as an important component of any investment focus that we have. So we've launched the Alternate Energy Fund, and that's going to look at renewable energy, but also self-generation, biomass projects, and alternative ways of generating energy alongside the traditional energy investments we make. We're an investor in Eskom bonds, for instance. So we do need to strike that balance in terms of the just transition of how we want to take it forward. But alternate energy is one of our proud investments and funds that we have established. The social infrastructure, there it is about how do you benefit communities, and the focus of our social infrastructure fund started with student accommodation, and we're expanding it to look at other sorts of social infrastructure. Very importantly is that there is a fundamental economic and investment merit in terms of those investments. So especially when you talk to social infrastructure, you really need to be mindful in terms of what is the business case, what is the investment case. As a portfolio manager, my primary responsibility is to generate returns for my clients.
Yes.
Then I want to look at, in terms of my belief system, how do I bring those together, and what are the purpose and the good things that we want to achieve them. So that's the focus of the Social Infrastructure Fund. And then the diversified infrastructure, if we're not aware of the 50-year backlog of infrastructure investment in South Africa, we're looking at the US and how they want to do a multi-trillion rand program. We also have a significant need for infrastructure. So we've also launched a diversified infrastructure that will look at water and sanitation. The next big crisis that we potentially face in South Africa is around water and sanitation. So that requires urgent action. So water is one of the areas where we want to look at. Core infrastructure like roads and transport and logistics, so those are important. And also the ones that we're starting to really think hard about is agricultural sector, whether there are viable investments to make in that space. So that's more or less the framework and the funds that we've pegged in. And if you look at our slide, you'll see we've been very deliberate in terms of saying we're trying to achieve a focused set of sustainable development goals. Not every sustainable development goal you're going to achieve in every investment, but in terms of the alternate energy, the thing that we really want to drive is climate action, clean energy, innovation. There has to be a heck of a lot of innovation in terms of ramping up these projects. So that's kind of how we've thought about it. Social infrastructure, a key focus on quality education. Healthcare would also be one when we start looking at healthcare providers, and diversified infrastructure really gives us a broad spectrum of the types of things that we could achieve. We're going to achieve more than that, but we do want to focus.
Makes sense. And as you said, you're starting with the end in mind. You are structuring the funds according to the SDGs that you'd like to develop. And of course, most importantly, making sure that the numbers and the impact do align with the investment outcomes that we're certainly looking for.